Hello. Today I will introduce you to the Redmi Note 14 5G. It is a mid-range phone costing between 200 and 300 euros depending on the version. The Redmi Note 14 comes in two versions, 4G and 5G. I will test the 5G version, which reuses some elements from other Xiaomi phones. Redmi has become a champion of recycling. It remains to be seen if this new generation has enough new features to justify its purchase. This is what we'll discover in this review, but let's start with the chaptering. I test products in my spare time. No one pays me to do this. I don't consider myself an influencer. Entertainment is not my thing. I have developed an objective testing protocol that you can see a summary of on your screen. My center of gravity is my blog, but I try to make videos when possible. Since I usually do them in one take, I sometimes mumble a little. If you like my work, you can support me with a like, by subscribing to my channel, or by buying your products from my links. If you have the winning numbers for the lottery, that's fine with me too. I'm not very demanding. Okay, let's start the review. I often say that the boxes all look the same. It's true, except that for this new generation, there is a change in size. The box is indeed smaller than the previous one. It is the first Redmi that comes without a charger. The box contains the phone, a soft silicone case, a manual, a needle to open the SIM drawer, and a charging cable. The Redmi Note 14 5G broadly follows what was done for the Redmi Note 13. The phone has almost the same dimensions with its 162mm by 75mm and 8mm for the thickness. The layout of the photo block on the back is also very similar, but a small difference where the photo sensors are encapsulated in a rectangular block. The camera block sticks out quite strongly. It will cause an imbalance when you put the phone on its back. The soft silicone case supplied in the box will help to reduce this effect. The back of the Redmi Note 14 is made of plastic with a slight texture effect. I find that Redmi takes a small step back in terms of finishing. The previous model had a back that looked like a layer of glass, and it gave it a more premium look. The surround is also made of plastic. The power and volume buttons are in the usual place. There is nothing new there. On the upper part, there is a microphone, an infrared transmitter, a speaker output, and a headset audio output. On the bottom, we find the other audio output, another microphone, the USB Type-C port, and the SIM drawer, which can hold two SIM cards in double-sided mode. You will have to cope with the 128 or 256 gigabytes of memory, because you will not be able to add a memory card. The 6.67-inch display takes up about 87% of the phone's front surface. There are visible bezels, but they are average for a phone in this price range. The screen is probably the same as on the Redmi Note 13. So, there are no major new features in terms of finish. I even find that this Redmi Note 14 goes back a little in terms of finish quality. The previous model had a more refined aesthetic. The screen is AMOLED and has a resolution of 2400 by 1080 pixels for a diagonal of 6.67 inches. The borders are clearly visible at the top and bottom, nothing new here. The Poco X7, which is in the same price range, does much better here. The Redmi Note 14 is configured by default in vivid colors mode, and as usual, this mode is not perfectly calibrated for optimal color rendering. I tested the other configurations, and I got a better result, but at the expense of a reduction in the color space. It's not great for HDR. After a few tests, I got a delta E of 2.55 for colors and a delta E of 2.32 for grays. To get the same result, it's very simple. You can keep the vivid colors configuration, but you have to adapt the color temperature and choose the warm colors option. I also measured the contrast and got infinite contrast, as is often the case with this type of screen. Redmi has been using good quality screens from the entry level for a few years now, and this is proven once again with this phone. With infinite contrast, you get a black that is truly black. The screen has become a strength of the Redmi Note for a few years now. They offer good color accuracy, good contrast, and an extended color space to read HDR content in good conditions. The screen is capable of exceeding 520 candelas per square meter naturally. With the sun mode, I obtained a brightness of more than 1200 candelas per square meter. With this level of brightness, you can easily use this phone outdoors without losing readability. With 1200 candelas per square meter, the screen will also consume much more energy. Your battery life will therefore decrease. I'll give you the screenshots of the technical specifications while I'm talking to you. I tested the 5G version with 8 GB of RAM and 256 GB of storage. There is a 4G version that uses a completely different configuration and less powerful. The price of this version is also lower than the 5G version. If the price is your priority and you don't need 5G, you could opt for this light version. The main camera is identical in both versions. It is also the same as the Redmi Note 13. No evolution on this side. The screen supports 3 frequencies, 60, 90 and 120 Hz. The battery has a capacity of 5,110 mAh with a charge at 45 watts. The technical architecture in MediaTek 7025 is a novelty, but I'll come back to these points in a few seconds. The Redmi Note 14 5G uses a MediaTek Dimensity 7025 CPU, where the 4G version uses a MediaTek Helio G99 Ultra. These are both entry-level CPUs with sufficient performance for basic use. I just find it a shame that they didn't make a little effort on this side. Even if I'm not a fan of the performance race, the Redmi range is starting to lag behind the competition. For the graphics part, this phone is based on an iMGB XM8-2 56 GPU. I haven't had the opportunity to test this GPU yet, but as for the CPU, we are here in the entry-level range. So you shouldn't expect incredible performance for demanding games. This is not a big problem since this phone is not intended for a gamer audience. Let's see what all this gives us in terms of performance. I got a score of 372,631 points with Antutu V 8. This is a fairly average performance level that is even a little lower than the previous model in its 5G version. This is a performance level that is quite comparable to the Samsung Galaxy A25. So, you won't be able to play demanding games with the detail level at maximum, but it will work correctly if you agree to make concessions on the level of details. To measure raw performance and energy consumption, I successively push all the components to the maximum for several minutes. On this graph, you can see the evolution of the test with first the CPU, followed by the GPU, and then the FPU. I then push everything to the max for several minutes to measure consumption and temperature. The CPU consumes a little less than 5 watts. The GPU consumes a little less than 2 watts, and the FPU is around 4 watts. When I push everything to the maximum, consumption does not exceed 5 watts. This is therefore less than the sum of the individual consumptions. This is the case for all the phones I test. I noticed 2 things with this test. First, there is the CPU computing power. It is very similar to the Redmi Note 13. The GPU, on the other hand, is lagging behind the previous model. The graphics performance of this phone will therefore be less good, and we therefore clearly have a regression here. With this extreme test, I can calculate a theoretical battery life for the crazy people who want to push the phone to the limit. I get a theoretical battery life of 4 hours 34 minutes, but it is very likely that the phone will end up overheating before reaching the end of the battery. Now let's move on to the battery test under normal conditions. I measured the charging speed with my Ugreen 100-watt charger, and it took me 110 minutes to go from 2% to 100% battery. As you can see from the graph, the charging speed is quite linear over the first 80%. It takes 79 minutes to reach 80%. The last 20% alone takes 31 minutes. This slowdown is present on almost all phones, so there is nothing abnormal here. With 45 watts of fast charging, the Redmi Note 14 does better than the previous model, which was limited to 33 watts. It is not the fastest phone for charging, but this level of speed is quite reasonable. This phone even beats the high-end Samsung, which is frankly lagging behind in terms of charging speed. I got a battery life of 692 minutes with maximum brightness and 1687 with 50% brightness. So, here we are, almost in a ratio of 1:3, where the consumption of the screen is absolutely not linear. This is what I explained in my chapter on the screen. The ambient brightness will play a big role in the consumption of the screen. I had obtained a similar result with the Redmi Note 13, probably because the screen is the same. With this kind of battery life and normal use of the phone, you should be able to get 2 days of battery life. The Redmi Note 14 5G takes over the main sensor of the Redmi Note 13. It is a Samsung S5 KHM6 of 108 million pixels. Don't be too quickly impressed by the number of pixels. It is not very useful unless you want to zoom into the image. A priori, the photo quality should be the same as on the previous model. So it is not this main sensor that will separate these two phones. The secondary sensor for ultra-wide-angle photos is a SmartSense SC820 CS sensor of 8 million pixels. I have never tested a sensor from this brand. I had never heard of this brand. I also don't see other phones using this sensor at the moment, so it will be a novelty for me. The macro sensor is also a SmartSense sensor of 2 million pixels. And finally, for the selfie sensor, the Redmi Note 14 is equipped with a 20 million pixel OmniVision OV 20B40, like on the Poco F range. I'll show you some photos taken with the main sensor while I'm talking. The new Redmi models are usually released in January. It's not the ideal time to take photos, but this time I was lucky. The sky was clear with a beautiful sun and an orange light of late afternoon. I've fed the gallery on my blog with more photos than usual so that you can form an opinion on the photo quality of this phone. I find that the photos are quite nice, the colors are well rendered, and the exposure level is good. I notice here and there some defects, such as the tendency to burn the light areas, as is the case on the bark of birch trees. I also see in the sky that part of the blue tends towards white or very light blue. This indicates a small gap in the dynamic range. Sharpness processing is a little too aggressive. It is especially visible on fairly thin elements, such as the branches, for example. These are normal weaknesses in this price range. I even find that this sensor does as well as phones sold between 300 and 400 euros. Before moving on, I will take a little detour by the 108 million pixels. The 108 million pixels are not a decisive purchase criteria. You can now see photos with a 100% zoom. There is obviously a degradation of quality, but it remains very acceptable. And this will allow you, for example, to read a sign that is too far for your eyes. We will now move on to the secondary sensor. This type of sensor is much more comfortable with landscape photos than photos like the ones I took indoors. The distortion is less visible and the lack of sharpness is less problematic. The color rendering is good. The dynamic range is average. The bright areas quickly go into overexposure. These are very common defects for this type of sensor, and this one does not do better or worse than the others. This sensor will allow you to take nice shots of nature when the light is good. That's it. That was for the photo. Now let's move on to the video. The Redmi Note 14 is capable of filming in 1080p and 30 frames per second. This sensor should be able to do better, but it is probably limited by the phone's performance. The result is quite similar to what I had noticed for the photo part, in particular the burnt side of very bright areas. I also notice a little jerkiness in the movements because of the 30 frames per second and a slight recalculation of the pixels. The result is quite acceptable for this price range. It is a sensor that will produce good videos when the light is good and when there is not too much movement. The Redmi Note 14 has a stabilization mechanism but limited to 1080p and 30 FPS. The stabilization is effective for a phone in this price range. The shocks are absorbed and I only see a recalculation of the pixels at the top of the image. The stabilization was reserved for high-end phones, but it is becoming popular in lower price areas. The result is obviously less good. but this Redmi does as well as some much more expensive phones. All that was for the day. Now let's move on to the night. I often test the night photo last because I have to find time to go out in the evening and preferably on a night when it's not raining. So, this is not my favorite part of the test, especially since the result is often disappointing. Fortunately, I sometimes have good surprises. I was surprised by the processing of night photos on this phone. The night mode forces the brightness a little, but the normal mode produces natural photos. I haven't seen such a level of quality in this price range for a long time. It's clearly a good surprise. Let's see if it's the same with the secondary sensor. This type of sensor is generally not very good for night photos, but I was positively surprised by the result. The photos are quite natural despite the big differences in lighting. The color rendering is good, and unless you move before the photo is finished, the sharpness deficit is not too visible. When I started filming this sequence, I was surprised from the first second because the video was particularly well exposed and quite sharp. I remember the night video I made a few weeks ago with the Poco X7. The result was clearly not as good. The Redmi manages to keep the focus in the right place, the jerkiness of the movement is present but limited, and I do not see any pixel recalculation. This is a very good result for a phone in this price range. I did not expect it, but the night processing is a strength of this phone. This part of the test is very technical, but don't run away because it is very important. Poor network sensitivity can make the difference between a good and a bad purchase. I made 2036 signal measurements and got an average signal of negative 105.123 decibels milliwatts. As you can see on this graph, the signal is generally quite stable. However, there are two different levels in this graph, as if there was a step between the two. I observed a disturbance in the network during the test. The network suddenly switched to 3G. I observed the same thing with my probe, so it is not related to the phone, and it explains the difference in signal level. If I compare the signal level of the phone and that of my probe, I see that the signal level of the phone is better. This indicates that the phone is rather on the good side of the fence, with a network sensitivity above average. Now let's move on to the Wi-Fi signal. To assess the sensitivity to the Wi-Fi signal, I made 293 measurements to obtain an average signal of negative 18.07 decibels per milliwatt. The signal is very stable over all measurements. The signal level is good, but it is clearly not a first-in-class. I would say that it is just a little above average. Now let's move on to speed. I measured a download speed of 433 megabits per second in 5 GHz, 72 in 2.4 GHz. This is a fairly average result compared to other references, but it is not a problem in itself. With 433 megabits per second, you will be able to watch streaming movies without any problem. This phone is not intended for a demanding audience in terms of Wi-Fi use, so it should satisfy a very large section of the population. Before finishing this network test, I will focus on the GPS. To test the accuracy of the GPS signal, I have two types of measurements. First, there is the accuracy calculated by the phone, which corresponds to the blue line on the graph. Then, there is the accuracy that I calculated between the latitude/longitude and the actual position of the phone. I took 1,706 measurements. To analyze the accuracy, we can see on the graph that the level of accuracy is not very good in the first few seconds. It takes about 30 seconds for the signal to stabilize. I get an accuracy of less than 2 meters with the value calculated by the phone and an accuracy of less than 3 meters for the calculation compared to the actual position. Why this difference? The 2 meters detected by the phone are the result of an estimate because the phone does not know exactly where it is. My calculation is based on the actual position of the phone, so the result is more realistic. I also see another problem with the accuracy of the phone. It is not stable over time while the phone has not moved. 3 meters is not as good as 2 meters, but it is still a good result. It is also the best result I have obtained since I have been using this test protocol. A difference of 3 meters can easily be corrected by a GPS application like Google Maps. The question of the performance of the phone remains, which could be a problem in the event of rapid changes. For the frequencies, it is single band like L1, E1 or B1 with support for Galileo, Baidu and GLONASS. I tested the audio quality on several levels and I will start with the external speakers. I created a 3-minute soundtrack with royalty-free titles, making sure to vary styles. The result is unfortunately not great. With the sound at maximum, there is a very significant distortion of the sound, and I also note an imbalance in volume between the two speakers. If you want to hear this for yourself, I offer you 3 minutes of suffering. Otherwise, I advise you to move on to the next chapter.
Our hearts beat to the city streets. We began to feel the fire. We rise like tall buildings as the chemicals that take us higher. The night's young and it's just begun as she puts her hand in mine. We wanna chase the night, wanna dance to the light, pull stars from the sky just two. At 29 and I find myself wondering, what did happen to the last 10? I ran away with my life, fast forward, never turn back again. It's kind of funny that the more we pass time, the more we need to set the rewind. And I got nightmares in my head, I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear, that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. Anxiety, filling up every space, no privacy. And silently, it could build and build until you finally see. Whoa, it's taking over, damn no closure, moving closer. No exposure, I just wanna be a loner. Some can't stay sober, look, you know.
The sound quality in calls is good with an average volume. The sound is a little more pronounced on the highs, and it is even worse with the external speaker. With the volume at maximum, the sound saturates and is very high-pitched. I do not remember having this kind of problem with the previous model. I will let you listen to it for yourselves.
For English, press 1. Pour Nederlands, toets 2. Pour le français, appuyez sur le 3. Für Deutsch, drücken Sie die 4. For English, press 1. Pour Nederlands, toets 2. Pour le français, appuyez sur le 3. Für Deutsch, drücken Sie die 4.
I measure the audio quality with headphones by playing reference sounds that sweep all frequencies. I measure the difference between the reference sound and that of the phone with specialized software. If I first look at the sound fidelity, I see that the Redmi Note 14 is quite close to the reference curve but has a small weakness at both ends of the spectrum. I compared it here to an old Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus. This comparison is not very fair, but it is the first result I had on hand. We can see that in the bass and treble, the Redmi deviates more quickly from its trajectory than the Samsung. This deviation will only be noticeable to a very attentive ear if you use headphones. It will, however, be more obvious on the speakers. My other measurements also show two other things. First, there is the power of the sound. I did this test with the volume at maximum, but I am well below what I usually test. The other problem is that even if the sound is less powerful, it still generates a saturation that will force you to lower the volume 1 or 2 notches to not hear saturation. This phone is therefore not intended for those who want to explode their eardrums with loud music. It will suit all the others who just want to listen to music at a reasonable volume through the headset. I used PUBG Mobile to illustrate the gaming performance of this phone. PUBG Mobile is a game that automatically adapts to the phone's performance. So the gaming experience is good, but it comes at the expense of the level of detail. We can see quite clearly in this video that the distance before seeing objects appear is lower. The level of detail of the textures is also quite basic. There is nothing surprising for a phone of this type. You will therefore be able to play games of this type without any problem, provided that you reduce the graphics quality and accept that the depth of vision is not optimal. I will let the video continue for a few minutes. If this part of us is not interested, you can move on to the next chapter. My videos are quite long, but fortunately, my conclusions are shorter. A little reminder before starting the conclusion. Before I launch into the conclusion, I will give you my usual internal communication. If you like my work, you can support me with a like by subscribing to my channel or by buying your phone from my links. I earned €111 with advertising on YouTube last year, so your support is important. Okay, let's now move on to the conclusion. I have been testing the Redmi Note range since the Redmi Note 5, and I have also tested all the models that followed. Testing a Redmi has therefore become almost a tradition at the beginning of each year. I remember my amazement with the first models. The Redmi range was so far ahead of other phones in this price range, it was almost an event with each test. Over time, this lead has faded, and testing a new Redmi is much less exciting. The Redmi Note 14 is not a bad phone, but I no longer have the wow effect of previous generations. The gap with the previous generation is so small that buying a Redmi Note 13 could still make sense a year after its launch. Its external appearance has not changed much. It is a question of taste, but I find that the Redmi Note 13 was more elegant. The screen is still very good, but it is probably the same screen as the previous model. The camera is quite good for this price level, but there too, it is the same as the previous model. The technical architecture is different, the computing performance is the same. The graphics performance is, however, less good. I understand that this phone is not intended for hardcore gamers, but there should be no regression compared to the previous model. The mobile signal is good, it is the same for the Wi-Fi and GPS signal. This is clearly a hidden advantage of the phone. There is an improvement here compared to the previous model. The battery life is good, the charging speed has improved, the phone is not very energy hungry unless you use it in strong light. The screen adapts very well to strong light, but at the cost of higher consumption. What clearly disappointed me, however, is the sound. The sound is less powerful and generates a fairly high level of saturation when the volume is at maximum. I have not heard such a level of saturation for a long time. I would have liked to be a little more enthusiastic about the conclusion, but the facts are the facts. The Redmi Note 14 is better than the previous version on network sensitivity and charging speed. For the rest, it is the same with some regressions. If you find it for less than €250, this phone remains good value for money, but the 13 should a priori be cheaper and represents its most direct competitor. That's all for this Redmi Note 14. I hope this test has met your expectations. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments or check out my blog for more information. Let me know what you think about this IA voice too. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you soon for another test.